sessions. So anyway, I'm pleased that you did that then, and I'm pleased you're with us here now. So without further ado, Laura Roberts.
Thank you, Dan. And it has been an honor to and a real pleasure for me to work on this project with NEMA, because it's painful to see a field in crisis. And so we're going to do 3 polls, and we're going to launch one. I actually am not quite sure how to launch the poll, Heather. There we go. So just to get a sense of the mood of the group, if you could just answer by clicking one of the 3 options. Where do you fall on the deaccessioning continuum? Do you feel that standards must be maintained above all else? And by standards, we mean the ethical guidelines from whatever professional association you ascribe to. Do you feel museums should be free to deaccession as they see fit, or that there should be some kind of middle ground? So let's keep that for a little bit, and we'll come back to the answers in a second. So while you think about that and answer it, so how did we get here? As most of you probably know, this summer the Berkshire Museum announced a new vision for the museum. Initial public response was actually quite positive. It seemed like a bold and creative re-envisioning of a 114-year-old museum. But then very quickly things changed dramatically. The museum proposed raising the bulk of the needed funding from sales of collections, citing the depressed economy in the region and a long history of structural deficits. But the response was swift and strong. Although some supported the museum's plan, opposition from museum associations, including AAM, AAMD, and AASLH, individual museum professionals, artists, art critics, and residents, was swift and vocal. I had to avoid getting into a conversation with a friend and neighbor who also is an artist and lives in the Berkshires at my annual holiday party. It's not really how I wanted to spend my holiday party. It's become a national story. NEMA and the Museum Trustee Association were unusual in their more moderate response, and Mary Wheeler from MTA is on the call today. Trying to be proactive rather than simply censorious, NEMA convened the think tank at the annual conference and published a white paper in the last issue of New England Museums Today. So this is step 3 in their efforts to take this opportunity to move the discussion forward. Maybe we could look and see at the results of the poll. Heather, can we close the poll? And
yep,
here we go. So 64% say middle ground, 16% say standards must be maintained above all else, and just 3% say museums should be free to deaccession as they say fit, which is probably, given that there are 58 of you on the phone, that probably means 2 people express that opinion. Thank you. So we're absolutely trying to get to the middle ground. The AAM convened a group of museum staff and a few trustees at the Harvard Museum of Science and Culture in December for a 2-day session they called "Don't Raid Cookie Jar: Creating Early Interventions to Prevent Deaccessioning Crises." You're probably, not very many of you are old enough to know the reference in that comment, which is an old article by Stephen Weil about deaccessioning as a cookie jar, in which he argued that since the vast majority of museum expenditures were for staff expenses, that staff were somewhat suspect in their financial decision making, because we would always be looking to stabilize our own finances to keep the staff. In any case, look for a report from that meeting soon from AAM. Dan and I were there and can add some of those discussions to this session. They have. So where are we? The Attorney General took the Berkshire Museum to court to halt the sale. 2 other parties filed suit but were found to not have standing. The injunction blocking the sale expired on Monday. The Massachusetts Attorney General asked for a 1-week extension, hinting that there might be an agreement in the works, but that's all tea leaves, and the court actually has not, as of 5 of 12 today, there's been no comment on whether or not the injunction has been extended. In the meantime, LaSalle University in Philadelphia announced plans to sell 46 works from their museum's collection to fund the college's strategic initiatives, triggering the same responses from the field. And at the AAM session, it was the folks from college and university museums who were the most nervous among us, no doubt with good reason, because parents' organizations are often skeptical of voluntary museum ethical standards. But then of good news, Garrett Copeland, the chair of the Delaware Art Museum's board and the grandson of the founder, and his wife Titania announced a $15 million gift, the largest in the museum's history. You will remember that Delaware Art Museum sold art in 2014 to finance its debt that Mary Wheeler explained to me was structured in such a way that it was impossible to refinance in conventional terms. The museum is now debt-free, and the gift will go to endowment and programmatic initiatives. This is significant for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that people have been making the argument that deaccessioning might reduce donor confidence and loyalty. I'm the first to admit that Mr. Copeland is hardly your typical donor, being president of the board and being the grandson of the founder. Nevertheless, it's a great vote of confidence in the museum. So we sign up for sessions like this one because we're all struggling to do the right thing for our collections, for our museums, and for our communities. No one wants to act unprofessionally or unethically. If you agree with me that there are no easy answers, you won't be surprised that we don't have any today, but we can report on some ideas and we'd love your reactions. So first, Dan is going to talk about some of the issues. Then we'll look at the solutions that came out of the think tank session and the AAM convening. Then we'll ask you for your feedback and other suggestions. So Heather's going to monitor the discussion board, interject questions as appropriate, and there are going to be 2 more polls before we adjourn. So Dan, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Appreciate it. Just a quick synopsis of this whole think tank format that we have come up with a few years ago at the NEMA Conference, and we've run I think it's 5 think tank sessions now, and the way that we structure those is really to actually try to find some solutions to a perplexing problem that the field might have, using the attendees to the participants in the session as sort of getting your ideas. And so that was what this one was all about. And the way they're formatted is that we start out with asking about what are the issues and questions around whatever the problem that we're trying to face, and those are usually charted out on easel pads and so forth. And so we started out this session at the conference the same way. And basically, the conversations about issues and questions sort of fell into 4 primary categories, and those are the relative value of objects and institutions was one, ethical standards being another, the public and community, and then finally the museum field itself. So the values questioned, to me, seem to be inspired by the notion that in the case of the Berkshire Museum, a small number of objects, particularly those Norman Rockwell paintings, are in the minds of some people more important than the health and the future of the institution itself. So some of the questions that appeared in this category were things like, what is more important, the institution or the collection? That was one that seemed to be repeated a few times. Is our obligation to our mission or to our founder's vision? Sometimes those are in conflict. Another question is, what do people value in an object? What is it actually that makes an object of value to anyone? And one last question here is, can one object be more important than the institution itself? And that certainly, I think, was raised, comes to the fore in the case of the Berkshire Museum when you look at those 2 Norman Rockwell paintings in particular that are causing a bit of a stir. Those 2 paintings themselves, are they more important than the entire institution? It's kind of an interesting question. So the second category of standards, questions of standards seem to probe whether the standards either are or should be absolute or relative. So the questions around standards were, how have standards changed over time? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the solutions part of our program here. What happens when you run out of room for collections, when your institution has accessioned things that they shouldn't have? That seems to have been a repeated conversation during the think tank session, because I think it's a situation a lot of us find ourselves in. Another question is, if your mission changes, can you deaccession to meet changing direction? What is the role of tradition in collections? Does hewing to tradition keep us from growing? And then a last question here in the standards area is, do standards impede our creativity? Or put another way, does it impede our ability to innovate these standards if we're, absolutist about them? The community and community relations category really made a statement that, recognizing that museums are in the eyes and lives of the general public, and what do we do about that? So one question here is, if we are supposedly public institutions, why do we receive relatively little in public support? Another question, how important is public opinion in factoring that into our decisions? Do we have an ethical responsibility to our community? And then finally, what does it mean to retain public trust? Because that issue of public trust has come up quite a bit in these discussions. What is it about this particular case that has to do with the public trust? And then the last category is the museum field. Many of the questions during the think tank were kind of inward-facing, considering aspects of the museum field itself that have an impact on this deaccessioning issue. For example, one of the questions that came up was, how much does peer pressure matter in this case and in other cases like it? How can we support our peers instead of censuring them? Do we have too many museums? It's kind of a provocative question. Do we have too many museums out there? Are we too competitive to help each other? And then finally, do we need to earn more and raise less? In other words, the idea of we're so reliant on donors, should we actually be focusing more on earned income somehow? So those were the issues and questions that were raised. Laura, do you have any reflections? Did I miss anything that stood out in your mind?
I don't think so. I actually just experienced a small technical problem, so but I'm here.
Okay.
I think that one of the things that really...
I'm hearing you quite as well as I was, Laura.
That's because I'm on the other... Let me raise my volume. That's because I'm no longer using my headset, which is somehow quick.
Okay.
So one of the things that struck me was how open the group was to think critically about the field, and to not, and in a lockstep way, just assume that we need to behave the way we have always behaved. And the recognition that we are in a brave new world with really, in some cases, quite different circumstances and standards, and that we haven't always behaved perfectly, and that in perpetuating old habits for the sake of tradition, we might be perpetuating old habits that really are no longer the right way to behave.
So let's go over this poll question. I don't know if you can do that. And Laura, if you can keep your off, we're getting a little feedback.
Okay.
So the second poll question is, why do museums exist? Kind of a provocative question here. To protect and preserve collections, or to serve their communities? Now, I know a lot of people would say, well, where's the one that says they're both? But I decided to make it a binary kind of a thing. Choose one. Okay, we'll give it a couple of seconds, and then Heather, if you can close it out and show us the results before we move on.
Yep, we're about 39 people have taken it. So.
Okay, come on, people, get those mice working. Put your sandwiches down. I'm seeing Emily.
So we have some people that are refusing to answer the question.
These are all anonymous.
Jonathan,
Okay,
your
I
mic
think we
isn't
have a
working.
good. It keeps reloading. I think that's more of a flash.
So there we go. Why do museums exist? Equal, totally equal, to protect and preserve collections and to serve their communities. So yeah, it's a tough binary choice. I know it's kind of not fair, but there it is. Okay, so Laura, you want me to continue on then with the proposed solutions that came out of the think tank? I think that's how we sorted this out.
Right, and can you all hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, fine.
Everybody else can too. So the solutions portion of the think tank, then we all broke into small groups, tables. I think we had 15 tables of 10, as a matter of fact, and each of the tables had a facilitator to sort of go over some of these issues and what kinds of solutions can we find. And so at the end of about a half an hour, 40 minutes or something, each of these groups then had a chance to give us their ideas that they had. So some were more developed than others, but interestingly, they all kind of fell into these 6 categories. So I'm going to give you kind of a synopsis of each of the ideas that the solutions coalesced into. So first of all was board training. I think that a lot of the table discussions revolved around the need for greater training for museum boards, museum trustees, and so forth. And I know this is a big generalization, but participants said that in general, board members often don't have an adequate understanding of how museums operate, and especially they don't have an understanding of the nuances of museum work that differ from those in other types of organizations. A lot of board members are on multiple boards, and they might be on the board of a nonprofit in their communities or whatever, and have that same assumption that the museum basically operates the same way, but obviously that's not the case at all. Now, of course, there's also a recognition that boards hold the ultimate power in a museum and have legal responsibility for its financial welfare, but the concern was that if they're not fully versed, that is the trustees, if they're not fully versed in museum field standards, they may not recognize the full consequences of the decision when it comes to deaccessioning. And those consequences can include things like the erosion of public trust and negative public relations, loss of standing and the potential to collaborate within the museum community, and potentially a negative impact on future donations. And they may not also be aware of the alternatives to deaccessioning or resources that might be in place to mitigate financial distress. I think there was some conversation about where would this board training originate. I think some folks suggested that museum associations like NEMA or AAM should develop board orientation curricula that address these needs and make it very clear. I think a number of comments, though, that we got were that museums itself, there needs to be a greater communication between the museum's professional staff and the board. The staff, which presumably knows the standards, a lot more clearly, should be more assertive when it comes to providing boards with information on the standards and why the museum should abide by them. So that was, sort of one of the ideas here is further board training. The second category of public relations was an interesting one. The general public, like the boards, might not be fully aware of all the nuances of museum operations. The comment was that the general public is also unaware, and and basically what's at stake in deaccessioning. In the case of the Berkshire Museum, which we've all been looking at, much of the negative public comment is focused on the mistaken assumption that the museum has literally a legal and ethical obligation to keep its collection in the Berkshires, especially those Rockwell paintings. So that's a misunderstanding, though, that may or may not be in fact the case. That in this instance, the legal challenge is still in the courts, but in a much wider global perspective, deaccessioning it is pointed out by a number of folks in the think tank, deaccessioning is a standard collection management technique practiced by museums worldwide. The question is, can it be done ethically or not? So the participants in the think tank said that the museum field needs to be doing a much better job of educating the public about the difference between ethical and unethical deaccessioning, along with the legal rights and responsibilities of museum boards to ensure the financial health of their institutions. I think there was also a sentiment that the public needs to know how difficult it is to operate a museum, especially in places that can't support its institution financially anymore, and that's certainly the case of the Berkshire Museum at Pittsfield, also the case of many, many museums around the country where their financial base is eroded, their community has changed, that type of thing. So the field needs to advocate more effectively as a whole, I think, for its fellow museums. I think also one of the comments here under the PR section is that participants observed that even if a museum is legally justified in selling artifacts, though, it needs to take into account the negative public relations that might come out of it. And this is where that whole public trust thing comes in. The museums really have to be very diligent about building public trust, and a word that was used very frequently in the think tank was transparency. They need to act transparently so that the community and all of its constituencies understand the facts behind its actions totally. The next one, which is sort of interesting, we're calling them A teams, and a few folks call them SWAT teams, a few other things, but the idea, remember Mr. T, that type of thing. The idea is that was an idea that came out and seemed to gain some resonance. The idea that one solution to this might be to have rapid response advisory boards or task forces that a museum could engage when it was faced with some kind of difficulties. And so these A teams could address perhaps a variety of issues, including deaccessioning and financial crisis, business planning, those kinds of things in general, and provide the museum with sort of rapid response, immediate, confidential, non-judgmental support from qualified professionals that might help out. So sort of doing these interventions perhaps. The think tank folks suggested that maybe these A teams could be composed of museum peers who volunteer their time to assist their colleagues and perhaps independent museum professionals and so forth. There was some conversation about AAM or NEMA coordinating these teams and possibly using our PAG system, Professional Affinity Group system, as a way to organize the teams, that type of thing. A big concern was how these A teams would be funded, because there would be some expense to doing that, and folks were suggesting that we encourage IMLS and other funders to perhaps subsidize the idea. The next solution, which I think is really one of the most fascinating ones that came out of it, but there was a lot of conversation about how we need to rethink failure, rethink the concept of what we mean by failure. I think a lot of us really noted during the think tank session that there is a great deal of emotional turmoil surrounding our field's response to controversies such as the Berkshire Museum. And I mean, it's so funny, Laura mentioning she had a guest at her holiday party talking it up. My next door neighbor is involved in it. I mean, you just can't escape this. And a lot of folks, it's like you have a lot of deep-seated, passionate opinions on the matter. But ultimately, and I think a lot of people were looking at the way some organizations and people were censuring the Berkshire Museum, and thought, geez, it creates a lot of emotional turmoil for us, because ultimately it boils down to how do we look at how do we view failure. And I think that the idea here was that we need to re-examine and redefine what we consider to be failures, in large part because museums facing financial crisis are potentially afraid of reaching out to their peers for support and assistance because of the intense negative stigma involved. They may cause a museum, for example, to become more inward focused and hunkering down and so forth, instead of availing itself of resources that might be available from the field. And you get absorbed with this fear of loss of public stature and, afraid of the witch hunt and that kind of a thing. So the idea being is we need to really spend some introspective time as a field trying to figure out how can we create safe spaces to have conversations that would encourage museums that are in financial trouble to look to the field for potential solutions and help as opposed to just hunkering down. One of the ideas also was folks pointed out that we need to have a more productive dialogue around what it means for museums to go out of business. Which I think a lot of people view as failures, but ultimately I think that there's been language and progress over the last few years of thinking about life cycles of museums, and that sometimes it's not a failure to go out of business; it's just part of the life cycle. A few years ago, AASLH created a white paper that was entitled "When a History Museum Closes," and gave sort of a decision tree on how to, very responsibly, distribute your collection to other institutions and those kinds of things. And so it was suggested that we need to have a much wider discussion as a field on that point as well. Relaxation of standards was another category of solution, and this one was, okay, are the current standards too difficult for museums to abide by? Is it realistic to think that every museum can in fact abide by these ethical guidelines from AAM, AAMD, and so forth? Some of the conversation, and I think Laura did a great job in the session of really providing the history of the AAM Code of Ethics, and pointed out that the whole current rule, the direct care rule, which AAM in AAM's Code of Ethics anyway, says that you have to use the proceeds of deaccessioning for either purchasing new collections or going to direct care of existing collections. That was approved in 1993, and that was in itself a relaxation of standards that were approved in 1991, which were much more draconian, which they stated that the proceeds from deaccessioning could only be used for acquisition. So when the 1993 rule came out, it was because nearly 3/4 of museums, according to AAM, objected to the restriction as excessively limiting. So the idea here, I think, in a little bit of a history lesson, is that these codes of ethics haven't been handed down on high, a million years ago. They were actually created in the 90s in particular, and they themselves reflected the state of the community, museum community that is, during that time. So the think tank participants kind of questioned whether the standards can ever be applied in an absolute one-size-all manner, and pointed out the differences and the conflicts potentially between the different rules that are out there. AAMD, of course, has a very strict rule that proceeds must go to acquiring new collections. AAM's is a little more flexible, talking about direct care, and AASLH is even more flexible because they actually recognize that historic structures can actually be accessioned as part of the collection, and that therefore you can utilize funds to help preserve the actual structure itself. Some of the folks in the think tank then took the observation a step further and suggested that perhaps a relativistic approach is much more feasible, in which an individual museum should be allowed to decide without prejudice what standards mean to them in the sort of case-by-case basis. That was one thing. And one other idea that is related to this that I thought was an interesting one. Somebody had mentioned that kind of a twist on the idea was to frame the discussion of the use of deaccessioning proceeds around the concept of an asset buys an asset, meaning that an artifact, which is in fact an asset, can be deaccessioned to pay for another type of permanent asset, such as contributing to an endowment or indirect care of collections, buildings, conservation, preservation, and so forth. So when you think of it this way, the public trust could end up being maintained by assuring donors and potential donors that their support goes towards long-term sustainability rather than sort of short-term bailouts, that type of thing. So that was relaxation of standards. And the last category, alternatives to auction, is kind of a catch-all, I think, that we put it in because there were a number of things that were suggested in the think tank that really allowed folks to, all right, what kinds of things can we do to instead of going to auction with these things, what can we offer as alternatives? One idea was to find sponsors for individual artwork or artifacts, similar to the way museums offer naming sponsorships to galleries, buildings, directorships, and so forth. This is kind of like an adopt a work or whatever, but possibly if you were to be able to find donors to adopt this artwork, it would give the museum funding for general operations or other initiatives while keeping the object in the museum's collection and thereby staying within the ethical guidelines of the field. Collaboration was another focus of the discussion, I think, at the think tank. Some folks suggested that museums should try to form strong regional or disciplinary alliances that would provide cooperative services and resources that would maybe help the financial stress of cohort members. Interestingly, some folks were talking about, if these groups were to pool or leverage their finances, there might be a way to trade objects in order to keep their collections aligned with their mission. I do know that some folks currently do that, but how ultimately can you find the value in the objects? That's kind of a question mark. A lot of folks talked about and observed the whole notion of consolidation and merger as a valid way of preserving the collection, and if not the institution itself. And a number of participants cited the recent consolidation of the Fruitlands Museum at Harvard, Mass. With the larger trustees of reservations, and so that was something that has been in the news a little bit, but ultimately the Fruitlands survives. They weren't able to sustain themselves on their own, but they survive today because in a different iteration, but because of the trustees of reservations being able to come on board. Some of the discussion also is how do you go out of business gracefully, which we mentioned before. Folks were talking about the Higgins Armory Museum, which ultimately merged with the Worcester Art Museum and sent a good part of their collection to the Worcester Art Museum, keeping the collection in Worcester itself. And the American Museum of Textile History is also currently going out of business in what a lot of people see as a responsible distribution of its fund of its collections at the end of its lifespan. And one last part of this then, and the final solution fitting in with the alternatives, the auctions, people talked a lot about advocacy, the way we need to, as a field, be able to advocate a lot more, and it's somewhat related to the public relations thing, but I think that a lot of folks feel that the main cause of unethical deaccessioning is financial strain. We get that. A lot of folks don't know how difficult it is for an institution to survive in these landscapes of dwindling donor funds, and participants really did feel that the field as a whole, led by AAM, NEMA, the other museum associations, should really advocate for more public funding and for more useful funding. And the phrase that came out was non-sexy funding, the idea being that a lot of the grants that are available right now to museums are always project-based grants. They require, a match very often, and it's just not that useful. A lot of what needs to happen is, we need to figure out sources of funding to help maintain the actual museum operation. A lot of those operation support grants have gone away. So that's something that we should be focusing on as well in the long term. So those were the NEMA think tank solutions. And I guess we're going to turn it over to Laura. You're going to talk a little bit now about what happened at AAM convening and how they compared to what we came up with at the NEMA think tank.
Yep. So thanks. So this was a session, as I said, in early December. There were, I'm going to say, about 60, 70 people there. The participants echoed many of the ideas that we came up with in Falmouth, including the idea of teams that could be confidentially called in to help a museum in distress, preferably earlier rather than later when a museum has more options and flexibility, before they have spent down all of their financial reserves. There was a lot of discussion about training for boards. The meeting ended with 3 teams pitching concrete ideas to the rest of the group and the group voting on those ideas. And 2 of the 3 were actually board training in some form, one far more ambitious than the other. Perhaps because they did not have the example of the American Textile History Museum in the room, there was less talk about closing, but there was one conversation about a museum hospice to help organizations close. And there was a great deal of talk about about the idea of merger rather than closing. And there was some talk about greater collaboration between organizations to affect cost savings. But there were four categories of some interesting ideas. The first were ideas about improving financial monitoring and reporting. So some in the group felt that their museums already had the tools to do this. They had strong treasurers or financial managers who understand metrics like debt ratios or days cash on hand. A large segment reacted as if they were speaking a foreign language, and one that they were not ready to learn. It really struck me how resistant some people in the room were to the basics of financial numeracy. This actually led me and Dan to talk the other day over lunch about whether museums have shifted resources away from financial management to fund emerging needs like marketing and technology, and whether that's hamstrung our institution's ability to be on top of financial issues. It's a sort of bigger question, but one that I'm very concerned about. There were ideas raised about something like a financial map, a financial museum assessment, or a stress test of financial visibility. But there were also great fears about that, worrying about confidentiality or the stigma of failing a stress test. So there was a strong consensus that any diagnostic or early detection system should be voluntary and that the results should remain confidential to the museum. But those fears aside, many participants would welcome straightforward diagnostics tools or a dashboard, perhaps linked to the data arts reports, which used to be the Cultural Data Project funded by Pew. Many already participate in data arts as a condition for other funding, so it seemed like, well, maybe if we could just add those questions in, it would be easy to do. Participants felt that these tools would be so valuable that they should be freely available to any museum, not just members of the sponsoring associations. So that was the first category about monitoring and reporting. The second category was about keeping objects in public institutions. There was some comment about what someone referred to as a museum pawn shop, an ability to facilitate sales between museums rather than going to open auction. An economist friend of mine raised a variant with me, which is how many buyers are collectors and how many are just investors. And would investors actually agree, the investor buyers, agree to keep their museums, to lend their acquisitions to museums? Because what they're doing is investing in the art. They don't want to keep it on their walls gazing at it. We always assume that buyers are collectors, but maybe they're not. Maybe some would be willing to place their sales back in the halls of museums. And is there some way that we can change, put covenants on sales or something like that so that things stay in the public domain? Many museums already have a preference to other public entities in their deaccession policies, but can we make these easier and more profitable? We may not know of museums willing and able to pay more than our known colleagues and friends. Of course, there's always the unresolved question of geography. So if you remember the Gross Clinic, the Aikens painting in Philadelphia, it was to be sold to Crystal Bridges, and then there was a joint sale to Crystal Bridges in the National Gallery. But the people of Philadelphia felt so keenly about it not leaving the state that they brokered a delay of the sale, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the the Philadelphia Academy managed to raise enough money. They deaccessioned 3 works between them in order to pay for it, to keep it in Philadelphia. So this notion of it going out of state is always an issue, going out of the region, but maybe we need to think about the public relations aspects of this, but maybe looking at a broader community of museums might keep some of this work in public domain. The third category of things that I would categorize were steps to improve museums' financial viability, either in the short or the long term, because improving our financial performance might avoid these crises. So one idea was providing financial relief without resorting to deaccessioning, somehow creating a rainy day fund to provide inexpensive bridge financing or other access to short-term financing to help institutions over a hump, give them a little bit of breathing room while they regroup. I'm not sure there would be $60 million available, which is what the price tag is at the Berkshire, but maybe some of these problems are shorter term. The most ambitious set of ideas were moving beyond conventional philanthropy to the emerging world of social impact investing. People were also wondered about new income models that are being used in other fields, and maybe we, as a field, have to think more expansively about how we're bringing in money. And then the fourth set of ideas revolved around better research and resources around all of these issues. There was a call for case studies of affected turnarounds or efforts to stabilize finances. There was a question raised about, do we have data about whether limited deaccessioning really works, or does it just delay the harder work of restructuring a failing organization? Delaware Art Museum is one data point, but what are the other data points? There was a sense that the field needs to better understand options such as mergers and consolidations. So there was a sense that if there was a better knowledge base, that boards would be able to make smarter decisions, drawing on the experience of other institutions instead of just their gut. Personal plug, I'm actually spending this year working on the research on some of these things, and never miss an opportunity to plug the need for examples from all of you who are on the call, to be in touch with me if you can help me with that. So we're ready to ask you for your reactions or other ideas about things that the field might do, or your reactions. Any other big ideas that you all have? Jonathan is saying that who used to work at the Higgins, that a merger would be a generous term for what emerged out of that, as opposed to, maybe he might prefer the word takeover. At least it wasn't a hostile takeover. But other ideas that you want to suggest to NEMA, to each other, about how we move forward?
Yeah, and I'll put this into context too. You know, this is kind of a rolling process for us. You know, collectively, I think that this is serving as a bit of a wake-up call. I mean, we've debated the whole deaccessioning thing for years and years and years, but this seems to have fallen into a moment that is requiring us to really take some action somehow as a field to figure out, okay, how are we going to deal with this in the future? And so, you know, as Laura said at the beginning, there aren't any quick and easy answers, but your thoughts here really are part of a process. And I think the next step is potentially, you know, we might do this again with some workshops. We might have another NEMA session, a session at the NEMA Conference this fall to sort of continue to follow up on it. The idea, though, being is that I don't want to talk this to death. I don't think anybody does, you know, but it's really, okay, what kinds of things can we actually put into place that are practical solutions for helping out institutions and supporting standards?
So Julie has added that we need some sort of industry standards, otherwise that would be dangerous and concerning. Mm-hmm. And I think that I certainly agree with that.
You mean industry standard, Julie, meaning not the ethical standards, but some other sort of industry standard on how to deal with these things?
So this is one of the disadvantages of this format. Yeah. We have to wait for Julie to type her answer.
Ethical and industry. Budgeting is obviously concerned. Yeah.
I want to get back up to Sheila's comment. Much of the conversation revolved around what boards and directors should do, but what are steps or activities that other museum workers can begin to take to keep a museum from falling into the deaccessioning trap? It's a really good question. And one of the things that came up at the AAM session, I would say, was about this question about innumeracy, that there were, that so many of us in the field, and I count myself among them. I'm not an innumerate person, but if I could program computers, I'd be making a lot more money. And I think that we probably have a below average knowledge of finances in the field. So I would say that one of the things that every museum professional should do, and that every museum training program should do, is be smarter about budgets, be smarter about these questions, pay attention to financial reports, and just take it as part of your job to be a financial steward for the institution. So that's both on the spending side, and then it's on the raising side, to not expect that the money for your programs is going to fall out of the sky. Take responsibility for development, take responsibility for donor identification and cultivation, and make financial management part of the responsibility of everybody in the institution.
Well, I'm going to reflect that too a little bit and say this is part of when it was discussed at the AIM session about this dashboard idea, sort of here are signs that your museum is either healthy or not healthy, and here's some of the warning signs. I would say that, if we were able to communally develop that sort of dashboard as an industry standard that Julie's suggesting, it really is the responsibility, though, of the museum's leadership to totally invest and empower the entire staff to be transparent and have everybody conversant with this so that they can understand it. A lot of times, I think all too frequently, especially in larger museums, we end up working in these silos that, one department doesn't necessarily know what's happening in another department, and, so the people that are involved with, say, collections aren't really completely in touch with the folks from development or whatever the case might be, and there's not a clear picture of the institution as a whole. If you had that, you'd have a lot more stakeholders. If you had a lot of people that are more conversant about the total health of the organization, you'd have a lot more stakeholders, and therefore folks that might be able to, sort of militate for, hey, did anybody notice that this is happening? This is something, because a lot of times these things are happening, that is, the financial crises are building over the course of years and maybe even decades, and it's only the people that are tightly controlling the information flow that know what's going on, and even they might not really fully understand it. So I think it's a bigger picture, but I'm convinced that it's sort of empowering the entire staff with that information that's going to help out.
So Rachel and Nicholas have had an exchange about responsible deaccessioning. I couldn't agree more. Institutions have to weed collections. They have to shape collections. There is responsible deaccessioning that goes on every day in institutions. And one of my worries, and fortunately most of it happens responsibly, it happens without public notice. One of my concerns is that conversations like this start to prevent the field from being able to do responsible deaccessioning. And change the conversation into an assumption that everything that has found its way into a museum's halls is valuable and worth keeping, that every decision we ever made, every accessioning decision we ever made was the right decision. And boy, would that be a terrible consequence of all of this. Now,
deaccessioning has gotten to be a dirty word. It's like it's pejorative.
Yep. And some of you know Ali Rico, who used to be the chairman of the Young and Emerging Professionals PAG. Ali wrote a technical leaflet for ASLH spring of last year on deaccessioning, based largely on her experience of an internship at the Bostonian Society. So if your organization has not done deaccessioning, and you're wondering how to do it responsibly, and particularly if you're a smaller institution, I would direct your attention to that technical leaflet, which all ASLH technical leaflets are available online for a very reasonable price. It's a steal. If you're an ASLH member, go back to your copy of History News from spring of last year. The other thing that I would say, in the response to this book proposal that I wrote, both of the readers said that they thought that a potential audience would be people looking at jobs, that people ought to be able to look at an institution and tell whether or not it's a solid institution, which never even occurred to me would be a use for this book. But I wonder how many people don't ask the right questions going into their job search. They're so grateful to get a job in this job market that they don't stop and say, whoa, there are red flags all over the place. One of the most egregious examples was, and I'm going to use names because it's such an egregious example, was when Rachel Tooker took the job as director of the Rensselaer County Historical Society in Troy. She got there, saw how bad the finances were, and said, I will stay for 2 months to help stabilize the organization, but then, no, I'm not staying. And I don't know how many of you all on the call have made that kind of mistake, but it's the other side of the how do you be part of the solution going once you're there, but also how do you understand it before you go. So, you know, to get back to this question of what can you do as a staff member, you know, ask your director to help the staff understand the finances better. Ask them to give you know, spend an hour at a staff meeting explaining the museum's finances and where the money comes from and where the money goes. You deserve it as a staff member. And don't do it as an act of aggression. Do it as an act of saying, I want to, you know, be a better staff member. I want to be part of the solution. I'm interested, the directors out there, would you agree to do that for your staff?
I can't imagine doing it any other way, as a matter of fact. You know, I believe so strongly in, you know, sort of sense of teamwork, but it's a different thing, you know, managing a small staff versus a huge staff as well. But,
so Paul Revere, small staff, Nina says yes. She apparently can't type, but she can vote.
It's a small room over there at the Paul Revere house.
Larger than it used to be. If you haven't seen Paul Revere's new building, you should.
Yeah, right.
Anne Grimes says yes over at the Constitution Museum. Thank you. So Dan, you want to launch your last poll?
Yeah, let's do the last poll, and this might actually give you guys a little bit more. There you go, Heather. Thanks. Thinking about, okay, just the NEMA categories. That is the one that came out of the NEMA think tank. I'd be very curious to know which of these you think should have the highest priority. Which was the best idea that the think tank came up with? Board training, public relations. We need to do more PR. Those A teams that sweep in and help solve colleagues' problems, rethinking failure, just simply relaxing with standards because they're too difficult for everyone to implement, and then finally all these different alternatives to auctions. So make your vote. Let's see which one of these has the highest priority, because this might help inform some of what we're thinking in terms of perhaps doing some workshopping or future sessions and that type of thing.
And while you're voting, Douglas Perkins, who I don't know, just posted a really wonderful idea, which is improving budgeting practices. Mm-hmm. So how often are our budgets predicated either on last year's budget as opposed to last year's actual, or the best possible actual as opposed to maybe a 3 or 5 year average of actual performance, which would produce more realistic budgets, even out the inevitable cycles of a great exhibition or snow on the day of your big annual symposium or whatever distorts a budget from one year to the next. So this idea, if I'm reading it correctly, of for everything, using a weighted average of multiple year budgets, multiple year performance actuals to budget. But I'm not quite sure. I understand, Douglas, about how that helps you see trends sooner. So if you could answer that. I understand why it would create a sounder budget. Certainly looking at multiple years of performance is important.
Well, he's thinking, I'm going to give Doug a shout out. He's one of our PAG chairs and also a newly minted NEMA board member as of December. So
great. Where does he work?
is participating. Middlebury College Museum of Art.
Right. And one of the things, there was so much anxiety among the college art museum people at this AAM thing. Yep. And of course, one of their issues is, and it'd be interesting, Doug can be a great resource to us on figuring this out, that the financial information that these college art museums get is so opaque, often so opaque, because it's tied up in all of their university data, that segregating what is really happening to them might be really difficult to puzzle out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm noting that whole issue of board training being a spectacularly convoluted one for the host of college and university museums, because it's not, it's not their boards, it's this sort of abstract, board of the general institution that they struggle with. So that especially in New England, because we have so many of them, college and university museums, this is a particular problem for us to figure out.
So before we go, I want to share a killer idea I had. Unfortunately, I had it really late. I was sitting in a college art museum advisory board meeting. The college will remain anonymous, and had an executive vice president challenge me about museum ethics. She said, "Is this law? Did the Brandeis case go to court? Did it set case law?" And I said, "No, it's not law, it's ethics." And her response was, "I don't care about ethics, I only care about legal obligations." The next day, I realized what the perfect comeback was, which was, for all of you who work in college museums, draw the analogy to NCAA regulations, which do not have the force of law, but which your college absolutely positively abide by in order to stay in the NCAA. My last word of advice.
That is a great one.
Okay.
Great parallel. So here we are. The poll speaks, and board training, overwhelmingly the biggest one, which is very, very interesting. Public relations, A-team's next, rethinking failure in there, and PR and relaxation of standards. Nobody wants to relax the standards. So very interesting. I think, would you say that board training, well, you did say it at the AAM meetup, that several of those pitches had that included. So that was obviously in people's minds there as well.
And I would say, and I would say this isn't just the wrap the board on their knuckles about our ethics. That's not what people were talking about. I think that there's certainly a part of that, but also board training to be better financial stewards, and on both the revenue and the expense side. I just talked to an executive director who, and this was also the case at Textile History, where the boards just ignored the financial red flags for years. And were so grateful when they got a bequest that would help them balance the budget, and put off the tough decision making. So, part of a board's responsibility is to be a check on the enthusiasms of the staff when they're treading on ground that's not financially sustainable. And I think that that's part of what we're talking about with board training. This is definitely not, responsive reading of AAM Code of Ethics over and over again. It's a lot more than that.
All right, and I am giving you all the opportunity, as I did at the think tank session, any ideas that come to mind over the next few weeks or so, go ahead and email them directly to me. I'm happy to sort of keep this conversation going and assemble any ideas that coming over the transom over the course of time. And truly appreciate your input. We're at the witching hour, it looks like. It's 1 o'clock. So we're going to have to sign off, but hopefully this has stimulated some ideas and not just capped them for you. Laura, I want to thank you so very much for helping with this, because first of all, me doing it alone is very boring, and it was very helpful for you to to add your wisdom and your thoughts and your facilitating abilities here. And thank you, everybody who cares enough about this field to actually show up for the Lunch with NEMA. Very, very appreciative. Any last words, Laura?
My pitch for case studies of financial distress, good and bad. I can tell some of them anonymously in my research. They don't all have to be success stories. Happy to hear about them. So my email is there too.
Laura, any sense of your timing on this book?
Trying to finish it by the end of the year. We need it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, right. Okay, cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.